My name is Robert Wakeley. I'm currently a doctoral student in flute performance here at the University of Minnesota. I'm originally from Seattle, Washington, but very glad to be in the Twin Cities now and working on this project. Like the flute, the piccolo is in the key of C. It sounds one octave above what's written. So the lowest note is going to be the D, a ninth above middle C, but will be written at the bottom of the staff in treble clef. The highest note is the C 4 octaves above middle C, although a handful of composers have written C sharps and Ds above that, although they're not very common and terribly difficult to play. So one thing that I particularly love about the piccolo is the different timbres and sound qualities that it has in the different ranges. The extreme low range of the instrument is a very sort of woody sound. It's not used very often, but when it is, it can be very effective. For example, once you get into the middle and higher range of the instrument, the sound can be much more piercing. It will cut through the texture much more easily. One thing that the piccolo does extremely well is to ride on top of a full orchestral sound. Even when the orchestra is playing as loud as it can, you can still hear the piccolo sort of riding along the very top of the sound in the middle and high registers. So the very lowest note is going to be, again, the D, a ninth above middle C. And the highest note commonly written for the instrument is going to be the C, almost 3 octaves above that. As far as key signatures go, the instrument is in C, and certainly once you get to the very distant keys from that, it can be a little bit more technically demanding. But like the flute, the piccolo is very capable of playing in any key. So when writing for the instrument, I would encourage you to have complete freedom to write what you want and in the keys that you want and how you want to write it. So one thing that I think the piccolo does exceptionally well, and that's one of the most fun things about the instrument, is that it can effectively take on many different characters in the music. And I think this can especially be seen in some of the orchestral writing for piccolo. So, for example, it can be very grotesque, such as in The Witch's Sabbath from Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. It can also be incredibly lyrical and beautiful. And for an example of this is in the recorder concertos by Antonio Vivaldi, which are often also played on piccolo. Perhaps the best known of these is the second movement. The piccolo also does a great job of showing a really playful character in the music, such as this excerpt from Ravel's Mother Goose Suite. And of course, you know, every other sort of character, slow, lyrical, sweet, intense, articulate. Really, there's an incredible range of what the instrument can do. The way that it's used most frequently and often most effectively is in orchestral and large ensemble writing, although it's by no means limited to that. So I would encourage you to explore some writing, look at scores, listen to recordings to get some ideas for how the instrument can be used. Some things to be aware of when writing for the piccolo are the ways in which the instrument will respond, in particular in the different registers. It's not a subtle sound. In the higher registers, it may not blend quite as easily as the flute, especially because it will be in a different tessitura than the other instruments. In the low register, it's actually a fairly soft sound and may not cut through the texture as easily. Of course, that can be used to great effect in many compositions. Dynamics, once you get into the extreme high register of the instrument, playing very softly is certainly going to be a challenge even for a very experienced player. And at that range, just expect that the sound will cut through the texture in any sized ensemble. As far as extended techniques, the piccolo can do most of the same things that the flute can. Probably the most basic is harmonics. So above a fundamental note, we would have the whole harmonic series. And so forth. The way those should be notated is to show the sounding pitch as well as the fundamental to indicate the fingering to be used. Whistle tones are a technique that's actually a little bit easier to do on the piccolo because there's slightly more resistance. Again, whistle tones should indicate the fingered pitch as well as the sounding pitch, and information about this can be found online as well. And it sounds something like this. As you're writing, keep in mind that it can only be a very quiet sound and perhaps can create a texture unto itself, but in the context of a louder 2D section would not be audible. Like on flute, multiphonics are possible on piccolo. The sound that they produce tends to be fairly soft and not terribly focused, because oftentimes we're finding the place between two different notes where both are able to sound independently, but maybe not with the same clarity that we would expect otherwise on the instrument. For example, they would sound something like this. In order to effectively write multiphonics, it's important to keep in mind that unlike a string instrument where you can simply choose two available pitches on adjacent strings, for piccolo and flute, as well as for other wind instruments, a specific fingering needs to be provided in the score for each multiphonic that is written. If it's something that you're interested in including, I'd encourage you to browse online, and there are databases of multiphonic fingerings that have been compiled and that you can refer to. But simply to provide two notes that you would like to sound at the same time is not sufficient in the case of these instruments. Another technique that works equally well on flute and piccolo is flutter tonguing, essentially rolling the tongue while playing a note. So it would sound like this. Another thing that can easily be done on both instruments is singing while playing, and it is possible to notate different pitches for the voice and for the instrument. There are some techniques that will not work as well on the piccolo as they will on the flute, in part because It's a somewhat simpler mechanism, and the keys do not have open holes in them, which would facilitate half-full fingerings, sliding open the keys to create a glissando effect on a flute. All of that on piccolo is going to be somewhat more difficult. That being said, the piccolo has an incredible flexibility in many notes for pitch bends. So for example, at the beginning of the final movement of Symphony Fantastique, the piccolo, together with the flutes, plays. Some of the percussive techniques available on flute will not work quite as well on piccolo, simply because there is not as long a tube to resonate. So things like key slaps, because the keys are so small, they will not nearly be as audible, although they're still possible. The same goes for tongue rams. And of course, pizzicatos are possible as well. And they can be written very, very softly, or to be much louder and using full air. A few possible limitations to keep in mind when writing for the piccolo, and I would prefer to avoid providing any limitations if I could, but of course we have to keep in mind the reality of the instrument. Playing, in particular in the extreme high register, can be very fatiguing for the audience as well as the player. So perhaps those very highest notes are best used for certain moments as punctuation rather than as the core of the piece. As any wind instrument, I need to breathe while I play, so having opportunities to do so. They don't need to be every measure, but I also can't play page after page without stopping to take a breath. As far as notation goes, one thing that I have run into a handful of times on piccolo parts is that cues indicating what the other instruments are playing will be written an octave below to account for the transposition. I think it's much simpler and easier to read if the cues are written at their actual pitch without having to worry about so many ledger lines or transpositions. We all understand that is the pitch the instruments sound at, and so it's easy to follow in that case. A couple of other composers who perhaps use the piccolo better than most others and provide really great examples of how it can be used are Rossini and Shostakovich. Throughout all of his symphonies, there's incredibly varied writing for the piccolo that can perhaps provide some good inspiration. I hope this video has been helpful in providing you some useful information and things to think about as you start to write for the piccolo and delve into what the instrument is capable of and how it can be used in a chamber ensemble and in any other sort of musical setting.